King Charles has addressed the ongoing topic of slavery reparations at a summit in Samoa overnight in his first official speech as head of the Commonwealth.
Our cohesion requires that we acknowledge where we have come from. I understand from listening to people across the Commonwealth how the most painful aspects of our past continue to resonate.
Well, some Commonwealth officials have called on the UK to pay compensation for its role in the slave trade. Something Sir Keir Starmer has all but ruled out. Our correspondent, Nick Dixon, is in Samoa. So, Nick, an historical moment in terms of the first address by the King in this situation last night, and also, I guess, as well, by the fact he didn't shy away from tough topics.
No, and I think that was expected, because obviously this has been in the planning for a long time, the King using all his diplomacy skills, Kate, for a very sensitively and carefully worded speech, such a significant speech for him as well. But it's interesting, being on this tour, Australia and of course Samoa with the Royals, we're very much in the sort of royal bubble here, going from one engagement to the next with the King and Queen, watching, observing them, obviously not talking to them, we're not interviewing them or anything like that. But it's interesting that this has really been, I would say, hanging over this visit and this tour. Certainly from when we were in Australia, we had a couple of awkward moments for the King in Parliament House in Canberra when that defiant protester marched towards him shouting, saying that he was being accused of genocide and mentioning reparations. Very awkward. Then the next day again, an Aboriginal elder referenced the reparations and the slavery as well. So these awkward moments have been coming up, and when we arrived here in Samoa, and of course knowing the Prime Minister was coming, it's just all intensified. And now we're in a situation where there are a number of Caribbean nations leaders who desperately want to talk to the Prime Minister, and no doubt the King, about all of this.
Thank you, Nick. So, should the UK be made to pay up, and is the Prime Minister wrong to rule it out? Joining us, migration and human rights lawyer Jacqueline McKenzie says it's offensive to shut down the conversation surrounding reparations and the UK should pay back, whereas political commentator Anaya Folarin-Iman argues the idea of the UK paying for something that happened thousands of years ago is absurd. Let me come to you first, Jacqueline McKenzie. The King has sort of talked about it. He didn't mention the word transatlantic slavery, but he says that, we have got a painful past. I want the Prime Minister's comments. So Keir Starmer's are quite interesting, because he's the person from Downing Street that has the ability to do something. But he's been very clear. He said, we shouldn't be looking at the past. We should look to the future. Is it something it's in our past, part of British history, that we should put away now?
Well, I think the fact that the legacy continues means it's very much part of our future. The fact that what happened over 400 years impacts on people today, on the lives of people today, means that this is happening now.
Explain how is it, without stating the obvious, but how is it impacting today?
So, in many ways, indebtedness, issues around health. I don't know if you've seen the CARICOM 10-point plan, but it talks about the sorts of things that ought to be addressed through reparations. So the fact that people, particularly in the CARICOM region, have suffered years of deprivation and underdevelopment, were left deprived when they gained independence. I mean, even things like the soil quality of those countries, because they were effectively overplanted with sugar year on year for 400 years, those countries struggle.
Yeah.
And because of that, we have to look at what kind of repair can there be. Now, it's fair enough to say that Britain is indebted itself. There are people here who are deprived. Why should British taxpayers bear this? I am a British taxpayer. Lots of people who are descendants of the enslaved are taxpayers. And not only will we have to contribute to this repair, we also contributed up until 2015 to paying off the debts that were incurred, compensating those who did the enslaving. What I think is important, nobody has defined what reparations exactly is. Nobody is arguing that you ought to write out a cheque for 200 trillion or 200 billion. But there needs to be a conversation. And what I thought was wrong with the Prime Minister's comments was just shutting it down. We saw this with the Windrush scandal. When it first came to the public domain, you know, Theresa May wanted to shut it down, didn't want to give an apology, didn't want to give compensation. The CARICOM Prime Ministers turned up in London in April 2018 for the very same meeting that's happening now in Samoa, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And the Jamaican Prime Minister, Andrew Holness, made that passionate speech. We got the apology, we got compensation.
Well, look, bring in it's right to have the conversation, isn't it?
I think we are having that conversation, and it's clear that there is no political consensus for this whatsoever. And I think that that's really the reality of what the British public believe, that the idea of the kind of working poor in this country, from any background, should be paying for actions that they don't support. Nobody in this country supports the slave trade, and we're not responsible for it. And nobody alive today in the UK was a slave during the transatlantic slave trade. And I think, with respect, I do think there's been a lot of conflation going on. The idea that you can create a direct link between what happened in the slave trade with all of the complexities that are going on in some of these Caribbean countries, I just don't think is true. For example, look at India, which was colonised by the British, is now one of the biggest economies in the world. Singapore was also colonised, and it has an extremely high GDP
that's two different things. You're talking about colonisation as slavery.
But we're talking that's different things.
Chattel slavery. People were bought and sold and executed.
Different things were talked about there about
chains.
Slavery and colonialism in terms of independence. But when it comes to actually the specific point of slavery, actually, there are complexities there. You know, nobody agrees with it. It was an absolutely horrific stain on our past. But the reality is that many African countries were also involved in the slave trade. In fact, in 2022, a leader in Nigeria apologised for Nigeria's role in their complicity with the slave trade. So there's actually a lot...
Did they also play reparations?
They didn't. No, they didn't pay reparations. So because there's so many different dynamics involved, this idea that you can just say Britain's solely responsible, who actually paid a lot of money to abolish the slave trade.
They were the biggest users of the transatlantic slave trade, without a shadow of a doubt.
Well, Britain was also the first empire to abolish the slave trade, actually.
Thanks to young black slaves who started the campaign. Let's never
forget
that.
Well, there's lots of different people that were at the forefront, British and other people.
Yes, people would do very well to read Richard Hart's book, The Slaves Who Abolished Slavery. It's an absolute nonsense
this idea
that side of history.
But in our talks about this point in legacy,
there were abolitionists in Britain. There were abolitionists amongst the people who were enslaved.
Which other empire abolished the slave trade first? Do you acknowledge that Britain actually did fight to abolish slavery? Do you think that has any role at all?
There were abolitionists in Britain. There were abolitionists amongst those who were enslaved.
I mean, it is right. If you look at, I've been to this Greenwich Museum, if anyone wants to go. It's a fantastic exhibition. It talks about, singles out 2 or 3 young black slaves who led the campaign. It took years, and it took many years in Parliament until the British government did anything about it.
That's just how political change does work. It does take a lot of time, but the fact that actually Britain did take on that role, and actually often much to the detriment of many of the African leaders at that time, the king of Dahomey at the time, opposed the abolition of the slave trade. So the history is not this simple black and white binary.
Nobody is talking about that. What this discussion...
What do you mean nobody's talking about that?
So what the discussion...
It feels like that people are talking about that.
Yes, but people rewrite history about the role of African kings in enslavement and so forth, and that history is not fully known. What we do know is that Britain has become very wealthy. I'm not saying entirely by the transatlantic slave trade, but partly because of that. We know that the royal family themselves funded some of those early excursions. The king himself has acknowledged this and said he's looking into the history of his country, of the royal family. Just this weekend, he's talked about, and looking at the painful past. There is an acknowledgement, and to say that the British public don't know this, we don't want this, we don't know what the British public want. And the British public is a very diverse community. In it
there are African people,
there are Caribbean people.
Well, the reason is because this is actually not anything that anybody's ever voted for. There is not a movement that has big cachet amongst the British public.
But
and if it was, then this would be a political issue within the British electoral context.
But you said the British people don't want this. How do you know that?
In terms of history, we absolutely should acknowledge the history. We should study it. We should talk about it. That's not what's denied. No. But I think the idea that we should be paying reparations to countries that have deep structural governance issues, I think it's a complete distraction from the real issue.
Tell me some of those deep structural governance issues.
For example, I would say, you know, my family's of Nigerian heritage.
I'm talking about CARICOM. We're talking about
just
CARICOM.
on the issue.
Can you just explain what that is very briefly? We are.
So it's the bloc. So like you have the EU of European nations.
Right.
It's the trade.
And what countries does it refer to?
So there's 15 countries, and it's mostly English-speaking countries with.
So you wanted to finish your point about Nigeria.
Yeah. So for example, you know, there's lots of challenges within the countries of Africa. Actually, there's even questions about when we send aid, whether or not that actually directly helps the people on the ground.
By current government.
Exactly.
Right.
So then this idea that bankrupting Britain to the tunes of trillions in order to pay money that will likely not actually help the deep issues in those countries, I just think is a complete distraction.